Oral questions by members.
Leader of Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 1,726 people died from an overdose last year. The toll of this crisis is disproportionately affecting First Nations people who are almost 6 times more likely to die from an overdose than others in our province. Carrier-Sekani Family Services wants to build a medically based and culturally appropriate 60-bed facility to respond to this growing and devastating crisis. It seems unimaginable that the Premier and his government wouldn't do everything possible to ensure that this badly needed facility moves forward. But a recent decision has made it virtually impossible for the project as designed to move forward. In a recent letter to the government, Carrier-Sekani Family Services says, and I quote, "We are in the midst of a tragedy for Indigenous health and well-being," end quote. Chief Karina Lewin has written to the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions, and I quote, "This decision fails to uphold your government's commitment to address the opioid crisis on an urgent basis," end quote. So to the Premier, why has his government failed to support the creation of this 60-bed treatment facility designed to provide support to First Nations who are significantly impacted by the opioid crisis?
Premier of British Columbia.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. And I share with her my sadness and disappointment at the escalating cost of overdose deaths here in British Columbia, not just in her community, but in fact in every community, Honourable Speaker. COVID-19 has made it even more difficult for us to deal with this scourge, this epidemic within our communities. We find people are using by themselves because of the restrictions that are in place as a result of COVID. We've closed the borders with our federal partners, which has led to even more toxicity in the drug supply, and that's why we're looking at a range of options. Certainly the option that the member raised about making sure that there are treatment and other capacities within communities is among our top priorities, but also dealing with the safe supply that's required to make sure that people are not losing their lives in isolation alone, without a loved one nearby, without a friend to offer a helping hand. The member knows full well from her time in government there's a multifaceted approach to addressing this issue, compounded, as I said, by COVID, but our commitment and resolve is as strong as it has ever been. I certainly will be prepared to work with the member to talk to the community in Prince George to find a way forward. I'm not aware that the project has been stopped. I am aware that it's not yet begun. But I certainly stand ready to work with her to get that objective that both of us share.
Leader of Official Opposition for supplemental.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate the Premier's answer, and I have no reason to doubt his sincerity and concern for the people of British Columbia and beyond. But what I am concerned about is that there is a lack of action and support on behalf of this government related to a very specific project, absolutely desperately needed and brought forward by the Carrier-Sekani Family Services Group. This is what the letter from Chief Lewin says, and I quote, "The province stands in the way," end quote. And the government didn't just stand idly by while the ability to build this treatment facility was denied. They actually participated in the process. Page 5 of the decision to block the project is very clear, and I quote, "Government staff submitted comments identifying concerns," end quote. 1,726 people died from an overdose in 2020, but the only comments on record from this government are not to support the project, a desperately needed 60-bed treatment facility. Will the Premier commit today to find a way to ensure that the project moves forward so that the Carrier-Sekani Family Services can provide desperately needed Indigenous health services?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And again, I thank the member for her persistence on this issue in her community, and it affects not just the people that she represents, but all British Columbians. And I have not seen the document that the member refers to. I know the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions is at the ready to answer subsequent questions from the opposition. Suffice it to say on my part, Honourable Speaker, again, I make the overture to the member, who I have worked together with since 2005, that I will be prepared to meet with her this afternoon to look at the details of this application to see what steps we can take to move this forward. If we are going to turn back the increase in opioid deaths, which we've seen since the pandemic started, we're going to need to do it together. Members from the third party have been talking about these issues, about stigma. We've been talking about this on all sides of the House for far too long without the type of progress I know the minister wants to see in her community on behalf of the Carrier-Secani Family Services Organization. But we could go to every community of every member in this House and find a similar challenge. And I know and I appreciate that we don't have enough time in the day to go through the need, but we have to have the resolve to work collaboratively to get to the result that we all want, and that is a safe place for people to deal with the challenges that they have, and enough frontline workers in place, trained here in British Columbia, to provide those services. People always help people. Programs need people. Facilities need people. We all want that same objective, and I'm confident if we work together, we can get that done.
Member for Skeena.
The time for working together and the time to look at the details has already passed. You've already worked with the Carrier-Secani Family Services in reviewing this proposal. And it's a specific proposal for a specific issue. Yes, we're in COVID. But I'm sure by now, this House knows that the issues that First Nations face isn't just because of COVID. It just didn't materialize over the last year. This has been going on for the last 40, 50 years. So the time for talk is over. The time to walk is now. And we've got a specific proposal asking for the NDP government to get out of the way and stop blocking this project. This is a 60-bed treatment facility that is being blocked by the NDP government. First Nations people represent just 3% of the population, but 16% of the overdose deaths. Chief Karina Lewin, and I quote, has said this: "The steps taken by this government to address the opioid crisis are not enough, and they exclude First Nations supporting and healing their own people." End quote. Will the Premier reverse this decision and let First Nations build this treatment facility?
Minister for Mental Health and Addictions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That the overdose crisis has lost so many lives in British Columbia is a tragedy. That it has hit First Nations, Indigenous people disproportionately is a tragedy. It's an embarrassment for our country and work that is long overdue, something that our government has taken up and is working in partnership with First Nations to overcome. We are counting on, as part of the provincial overdose response and addictions treatment and recovery, working directly with First Nations Health Authority. To that end, we've got a $20 million commitment to 2 new and 6 replacement healing and treatment centers. We were counting on Carrier-Secani proposal being one of them. Last week, on the 9th of March, I met with Chief Karina Lewin. I expressed to her that I shared absolutely her disappointment that the Agricultural Land Commission, an independent body, had rejected the non-farm use on ALR land of the use that was proposed. That's an independent body. This is not an NDP government decision. The NDP government decision was to fund the treatment and recovery centers. The Agricultural Land Commission made a different decision, believing that it is protecting farmland. But we're not leaving that there. I'm working with my counterparts in cabinet. Given my commitment to Chief Karina Lewin, that we will pursue this further. Our investment in Carrier-Secani Family Services remains. We are highly reliant on them as a deliverer of services right now all across BC's Northwest. And we're determined to continue to do the work with First Nations Health Authority and with Indigenous leadership to make sure that we're designing treatment services to prevent and overcome the overdose crisis in a way that's designed by Indigenous people. We've got lots to learn from them. We're
Thank you,
determined to
Minister.
do it together.
Member for Skeena, supplemental.
Well, that's not what Chief Lewin is saying in her letter. She says Part 5 decision to block the project is very clear, and I quote, government staff submitted comments identifying concerns, end quote. She doesn't make any differentiation between any of the programs or the different ministries. She sees us as government, and she sees us as a way the government to stop the blocking of this project. And she wants to see the talking end. She wants to see ministers stop referring to their briefing sheets. She wants to see the talk of reconciliation have some real meaning in a time of crisis. Not to say that the opioid deaths before COVID wasn't a crisis. The substance issues that First Nations face and social issues faced before COVID was a crisis. Now it's amplified, now it's magnified. And all we hear about is more talk, more review, let's work together. But in the meantime, let's block this 60-bed facility. Every minister's mandate letter says, and I quote, reconciliation is a shared responsibility for us all, end quote. But these words are hollow when this government blocks Indigenous people from tackling issues in their own community. First Nations that want to address their own issues on their own terms. And all they need is some partnership. And all they need is for government to get out of the way. 16% of overdose deaths were First Nations people.
Question, member.
Where's the common sense? My question is, where's the common sense in this decision? I just don't get it. It's time the Premier stopped with empty words and actually did something. Will he do it?
Minister of Mental Health and Addictions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I share the member's dismay at the decision that the Agricultural Land Commission made about uses of agricultural land, land in the ALR. I have given my word when I met last week with the chief of the Carrier-Sakani First Nation that I will do what I can. We are partners, we are investors in this addiction and treatment and recovery healing center. We were counting on them being able to proceed with its development, that the Independent Agricultural Land Commission made a decision based on different criteria. I share the chief's discouragement, and we met within days of me receiving the letter, and I will be in touch with her again as soon as I've been able to see how we can find a way forward.
Member for Saanich North and Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I heard the Minister of Forest's response to my colleague last week, and frankly, it was like Groundhog Day. If the Premier thinks British Columbians will accept his minister simply recycling the previous minister's talking points from 2017 on old growth, he's mistaken, Mr. Speaker. The Premier committed during the snap election to implement all of the old growth panel's recommendations, including the panel's call to immediately halt logging in the most endangered old growth forest ecosystems. As my colleague pointed out last week, we are now past the 6-month mark since government released the old growth panel, and we are coming up on a year since the government received that report. However, to date, we've seen almost zero action towards the Premier's promises. The only step taken so far, a set of deferrals announced in September, include very little of the grandest, high-productivity old growth stands at the heart of this debate. These are the monumental trees that tower high above you, the majestic forests that provide homes for so many species, including endangered species. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Forests, Lands, Natural Resource Operations. What immediate steps is she taking to fulfill the Premier's response and halt logging in our highest risk, high productivity old growth forests?
Minister of Forests, Land, Natural Resource Operations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. And we want old growth forest to be appreciated by people today and in the years to come. It's also a priority for our government to support good jobs for people in BC's forestry sector. And that's why our government asked an independent panel to advise us on how we could do better when it comes to protecting our old forests. And our government is dedicated to implementing the 14 recommendations to ensure a new holistic approach on how we manage BC's old growth forests. And that's why, as a first step, just a first step, member, in September, we collaborated with Indigenous governments and protected old growth in 9 different areas across BC. And that was one of the recommendations that the panel put forward. The very first recommendation was to make sure that we are working with Indigenous nations across the province, and that's what we did. That's our first step. There is more action to come, and we will be doing this. We also brought in a special tree regulation, so 1,000 to 1,500 of those special trees the member referenced will be protected. So we are moving ahead to protect old growth forests in this province. We are moving away from the divisive actions of the past government to make sure that we are working together. We are working with Indigenous nations, we are working with communities, we are working with corporations, with labor, with environmental organizations, and communities who are dependent on the forest industry to ensure we can move forward in this province.
Member for Saanich Northern Ireland, supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And unfortunately, while the talking continues, the logging continues. And those trees, those monumental trees, are the ones that are being cut first, Mr. Speaker, because they are the ones that the forestry industry sees as the most valuable. They're the ones that they want access to. So while we talk in this place, we log. And those trees are the ones that are falling first. Mr. Speaker, this government is getting a failing grade from the lack of action so far on old growth, from both environmental groups that the minister talked about and conservationists. As experts have pointed out, the steps taken to date have been highly problematic, leaving out those monumental trees in at-risk valleys. And Mr. Speaker, the government has seriously exaggerated how much old growth forest they have actually protected. Scientists have run the numbers and have shown that this government has given interim protections to less than 1% of the remaining high productivity, big tree stands left in our province. So the clear cutting is continuing in critical old growth stands across British Columbia and right under our nose with the direct approval of this Premier and his minister. My question again is to the Minister of Forest, Lands and Natural Resource Operations. When can we expect at least interim protections for these rare ancient forests? Or is the 1% all she's protecting?
Minister of Forest, Land and Natural Resource Operations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And well, the member, his numbers are inaccurate. So let's just clarify a few things. In this province, there are 95 million hectares of land. Of that, 57 million hectares is forested, 57 million hectares. Of that 57 million hectares, 13.7 million hectares is old growth forests. And of that, 10 million hectares is protected. That leaves 3.7 million hectares that may be harvested, Mr. Speaker. I didn't say harvested, may be harvested. Also, there is the special tree regulation. So if someone goes into a stand and sees a special tree, the very tree the member references, they are to protect that tree. And that includes over 1,000 to 1,500 trees in our province. We are committed to following the recommendations of the Old Growth report. And I want to thank the members. I want to thank Al Gorley and Gary Merkel for the work they did, the very thoughtful work they did as professional foresters. And Gary is a member of the Tahltan Nation. And we are moving forward to make sure that we have that government-to-government discussion with Indigenous nations. And that's one of the reasons we could defer those 9 areas with that critical old growth forest in it right off the bat, because there were those discussions with the Indigenous nations who were affected. So that is critically important to us. We are moving forward. We are making sure that we have the government-to-government discussions with the First Nations. We are looking at what other old growth forests we can defer. We're also working with the companies, with labor, with environmental groups, and those communities who are dependent on old growth forests in this province. It is not either or. It is making sure that we have a sustainable, well-managed forest industry while also protecting old growth forests.
Member for Surrey White Rock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier stated today that every community is facing a challenge on the file of mental health and addictions. He's right. Pathways Addiction Recovery Centre has been a cornerstone of the Penticton community, serving over 1,000 clients a year for 20 years. 2 weeks ago, the Premier and this government decided to end that funding and put 1,000 people's treatment at risk. At a time when overdose deaths are at an all-time high, it makes zero sense for this Premier to be taking away a recovery option for local communities. My question is to the Premier. Will he commit today to stop the closure of the Pathways Treatment Centre?
Minister of Mental Health and Addictions.
Because addictions counseling is such an important part of people's path to treatment and recovery, the increase in investments of all sorts of support for people in interior health is something that we have funded as a government. Pathways has been a critical part of that. They've been providing service in Penticton for almost 20 years now, a very valued member of the community, and we're really grateful for their work as a contractee of Interior Health. So Interior Health tells us that they are now shifting their substance use counseling to a different form of, instead of external contract, they're bringing it in-house. They assure us that when the existing contract with Pathways ends May 31st, that there will be no disruption in service for people that are reliant on it. They say that this will better support people on the whole continuum of care, not just counseling, but treatment as well, and that it will also help provide services more broadly in the whole South Okanagan, not just in, not only in Penticton. Interior Health, as all the health authorities are, making their own decisions about addictions, mental health, and health delivery. They start and stop contracts all the time. That this is coming in-house is hoped to bring more stability of care for the people that need it.
Member for Surrey White Rock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What's clear to me today is that the minister responsible for mental health and addictions doesn't have a lot of responsibility. It's a fact. Protesters gathered over the weekend to fight this Premier's decision to close the Pathways Treatment Centre. They included people like Cindy Ramsey, whose family member is among the thousands of clients who receive life-saving treatment from Pathways. She says, and I quote, "I have to question this decision now during this time of COVID, when people are isolated, addictions are going up, and this is just one more nail in the coffin." We just heard the minister say, it's not my responsibility, somebody else's. So again, my question is to the Premier. Listen, that's what she said, I didn't say it. My question is to the Premier. Will he step in and restore the funding to the treatment centre?
Minister of Mental Health and Addictions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Where the BC Liberal government failed to invest in mental health and addictions treatment, our government is, and the health authorities are the ones that deliver the service. Here is some of what is newly available under our NDP government with Interior Health to help people with mental health and addictions treatment. In Interior Health alone, this is what is new and available. We just this month added 10 new government-funded youth treatment beds. They've come online. They're helping people right now. Also this month, 5 new innovative integrated treatment teams are beginning to see clients throughout the southern interior. Kamloops, Cranbrook, West Kelowna, Enderby, and Salmon Arm areas all have these new teams that are helping people get addiction support, beating back stigma that couldn't get it before. We've just opened a new urgent primary care center in Penticton. It's opening at the end of March. It will provide long-term primary care so people can get all their healthcare needs, including mental health and addictions. It's particularly focused on specialized services. And there's more. These are all things that our government is choosing to fund where the previous government did not.
Member for West Vancouver, Capilano.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pathways is low barrier. It offers a continuum of care that can last years, as well as a drop-in center that anyone off the streets can come in to see them. This is not the case in an urgent care center. People in Penticton will be losing access to these drop-in services, which Interior Health says will no longer be offered. People needing treatment will be forced to wait in line at the local clinic instead of receiving specialized services. Why is the Premier eliminating drop-in services for those with mental health challenges?
Minister of Mental Health and Addictions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When the existing contract, external contract, ends on May 31st, Interior Health assures us there will be no disruption in continuity of care for people that need it. We are adding a multitude of ways, more and more services for people to be able to overcome stigma, have services that meet them where they are at. This is an unprecedented expansion in access to addictions treatment support. Beyond anything British Columbia has ever seen, and the need is deeper than anything British Columbia has ever seen. The loss of life from the overdose crisis has meant that we have accelerated British Columbia's response enormously. We have more than 200 government-funded treatment beds in Interior Health. We've added Foundry locations, peer-led for young people and young adults in Kelowna and Penticton to support young people with mental health and addiction issues. In every way, there are more services available and designed by people that need the services most. I am assured by Interior Health that, that there will not be any interruption to service for people in Penticton.
Member for West Vancouver, Capilano Supplemental.
Having access to a drop-in center and being able to meet people where they're at is such an important piece of supporting the mental health of our communities. The families who have benefited from Pathways disagree with this government. Julie Gull says, quote, Interior Health will not be able to meet the same level of care that Pathways does, end quote. Or Kim Rowe, who says, quote, the service that Pathways provides is priceless. It is not a model that can be copied by Interior Health, end quote. Why is the Premier taking away a trusted local treatment option, closing this treatment centre and reducing services to those in need?
Minister of Mental Health and Addictions.
The service that Pathways has provided for almost 20 years in Penticton is appreciated, and at a contract level, Interior Health has decided not to renew the contract, which was known a couple months ago. The contract will run until the end of May, and Interior Health says this is going to represent, once the services are brought in-house and expanded, that will represent an expansion of treatment services for people in the region. Frankly, it's dangerous for the opposition to suggest that there are not treatment options for people. There are expanded in every parts of the province, more options for addictions treatment and support and recovery than there have ever been before. The need is deeper than it has ever been before. But please, anybody that is watching, if you need support, whether it's virtual or in person, you can look at gov.bc.ca/COVID-19 mental health and addiction supports. There is a great range, much of it designed for people with lived and living experience so that we can, as the member says, meet people where they are at. Information publicly made available from Interior Health says that on a medical basis, there is not going to be any reduction in care for people in need. There will be an expansion, and I hope the member will get behind that message from our health authority and let people know that help is there for them.
Member for Peace River North.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. The pandemic has been a very stressful time for British Columbians. As the Premier has pointed out, and I quote, "It's a pandemic, dude." Well, in the middle of this pandemic, the Premier has heartlessly chose to cut $300 a month from those who need it the most, people living with disabilities and low-income seniors. It was the Premier who made this as complicated as possible for people to apply for the COVID benefit. It's the Premier who is making them wait and stressing them out as he delays support. I'm just one voice doesn't cut it. These people deserve an honest answer from the Premier. In fact, this week there is a group of advocates that are going to be hosting an online rally. Will the Premier restore the $300 that he cut from seniors and those living with disabilities?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. He's got the facts a little bit wrong. We didn't cut the program. We created the program. We put $300 in people's pockets. After a decade of no increases to income assistance, what did we do? We increased income assistance. The emergency benefit that was to be for 3 months and then for 6 months went to be 9 months. We made it $150, and we made it so easy for the $1,000 benefit that everybody got it automatically. So, Honourable Speaker, if the honourable member from way the heck over there wants to stand up and talk about the vulnerable in his community, do some history, man. You did nothing for a decade.